The wind was a thief. It stole the warmth from her bones, the moisture from her lips, and the hope from the very air she breathed. Alara stood on the porch of the cabin that was no longer hers, a splintered monument to a dead man's dream. The dust, fine as milled flour, coated everything, a relentless brown shroud over a world that had forgotten the color green. It swirled in the yard where her meager garden had surrendered, its skeletal remains rattling a dry lament. Thomas had promised her a life here. He had spoken of soil so rich it would yield to the slightest touch, of a sky so vast it would hold all their ambitions. He had not spoken of the fever that would take him in a single, sweating night, nor of the creditors who would circle like buzzards before his body was even cold. And he had certainly never spoken of Silas Croft, a man whose heart was as barren as the land he now claimed. Her gaze drifted to the edge of the property, where Croft's new fence posts stood like raw, unhealed wounds in the earth. He had given her until sundown. The thought was a cold stone in her stomach. Sundown. Where would she go? The town of redemption was a collection of hard stares and whispered judgments. A widow with no kin and no coin was less than nothing, a burden to be shunted aside. She had seen the way the other women looked at her, a mixture of pity and morbid fascination, as if her failure was a contagious disease. She clutched the thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, the fabric worn to the consistency of a cobweb. Inside the cabin, her packed life sat in a single, pathetic carpet bag. A change of clothes, her mother's tarnished locket, and a Bible whose promises felt like mockery. Fear was a physical presence, a cold hand gripping her throat. It was the fear of starvation, of the coming winter, of the nameless, shadowy violence that preyed on solitary women in a land governed by strength and ruthlessness. She was watching the sun begin its slow, bloody descent when the shadow fell over her. It was so large, so sudden, that for a moment she thought a cloud had blotted out the light. She turned, her breath catching in a knot of fresh terror. He stood there, not 10 feet away, a man who seemed less born of the earth and more carved from it. He was immense, taller than any man she had ever seen, with shoulders that strained the seams of his simple leather tunic. His face was a landscape of harsh angles and old sorrows, framed by 2 long, black braids that lay starkly against his chest. She knew who he was. The townsfolk spoke of him in hushed, fearful tones. The Comanche who lived alone in the mesas, a ghost from a vanquished world. They called him Kano. They said he was haunted. He did not move, his dark eyes taking in the scene with an unnerving stillness. The new fence, the barren yard, her thinness, the desperation she knew must be etched onto her face. He was an intimidating presence, yet his stillness was not menacing. It was watchful, ancient. She could feel the weight of his gaze, an assessment that went deeper than skin. He had likely been watching her for some time, a silent observer from the high rocks that overlooked her ruin. The silence stretched, filled only by the ceaseless moan of the wind. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. She expected a threat, a demand, a sneer. He offered none of it. When he finally spoke, his voice was as low and resonant as distant thunder, a sound that seemed to vibrate in the very planks beneath her feet. "They take your land," it was not a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered with a stark finality that left no room for argument or explanation. Alara could only nod, her throat too tight for words. She felt a humiliating flush of tears sting her eyes and willed them back. She would not cry in front of this stranger. She had no tears left to spare. He looked from her to the setting sun, then back again. His expression was unreadable, a mask of stoicism that betrayed nothing of his thoughts. He took a single step forward, and she flinched, a purely instinctual reaction. He stopped, his gaze unwavering. There was no pity in his eyes, and for that she was strangely grateful. Pity was a useless currency. What she saw instead was a profound understanding of loss, a recognition that mirrored the hollow space inside her own chest. He had seen this before. He had lived it. The wind whipped a strand of her pale hair across her face, and she pushed it away with a trembling hand. "I need a woman," he stated, the words stripped of all artifice. They were as raw and direct as the landscape around them. Her mind reeled, a fresh wave of fear crashing over her. But his tone held no lewdness, no cruel insinuation. It was a declaration of need, simple and profound. He paused, letting the weight of his statement settle in the dusty air between them. Then, he delivered the second half of the proposition, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that pinned her in place. "And you need a home." The offer hung there, suspended between the ruin of her past and the terrifying void of her future. It was an impossible choice, a bargain offered by a ghost at the edge of the world. Go with this feared, haunted man, this outcast from a broken people, or face the slow, certain death that awaited her alone. The sun touched the horizon, painting the clouds in fiery shades of orange and violet, the last gasp of a dying day. Her world was ending, but in the unflinching gaze of the giant before her, she saw not an end, but a stark, terrifying, and perhaps the only possible beginning. She thought of the cold, of hunger, of Silas Croft's triumphant, gloating face. And then she looked at the silent, waiting man who offered not comfort or kindness, but the one thing she desperately needed: survival. The walk to his home was a silent pilgrimage into a foreign land. She followed the broad, steady line of his back as he moved through the twilight, his steps sure-footed and quiet on the rocky ground. He did not look back to see if she was following. He simply knew. The air grew cooler as they ascended, leaving the flat, broken plains behind for the rising sanctuary of the mesas. The world she knew, the dusty streets of redemption, the failed promise of her farm, shrank below them until it was nothing more than a patchwork of deepening shadows. He led her to a place nestled against the sheer red cliff face, so skillfully integrated into the rock that one could easily miss it. The home was not a cabin built to defy the land, but a dwelling that seemed to have grown from it. Its walls were part adobe, part living stone, with a low, sturdy roof of packed earth and juniper branches. A thin curl of smoke rose from a chimney, a fragile thread of life in the vast, indifferent wilderness. Inside, a single fire burned in a stone hearth, casting a warm, flickering light that danced across the smooth, earthen walls. The space was larger than it appeared from the outside, a single room that was meticulously clean and ordered. Pelts were stacked neatly in one corner, dried herbs hung from the ceiling beams, and a collection of tools lay arranged by size against one wall. There was a simple table with 2 stools, and a sleeping pallet of furs in the far corner. It was a place of quiet purpose, devoid of sentimentality but filled with a sense of profound stability. It was more of a home than the drafty, splintered cabin she had just left behind. He gestured toward the fire, an unspoken invitation to take the warmth. Alara moved slowly, her body stiff with exhaustion and apprehension, and sat on a low stone ledge by the hearth. The heat seeped into her chilled skin, a small creature comfort that felt like an overwhelming luxury. He moved about the room with an economy of motion, placing a pot of water over the fire before taking a piece of dried venison from a hook. He sliced it with a long, sharp knife and dropped the pieces into the pot, along with a handful of dried roots. He did not speak to her, and she did not speak to him. The silence was not empty. It was filled with the crackle of the fire, the whisper of the wind outside, and the weight of their unspoken agreement. This was not a rescue. It was a transaction. He had offered a roof and she had accepted. The terms of her role, of what it meant to be his woman, remained a terrifying, unspoken question mark hanging in the air. She watched his hands as he worked. They were large and calloused, scarred from a life of hardship, yet they moved with a surprising dexterity and care. He was a man accustomed to solitude, to providing for himself in a world that had taken everything from him. When the stew was ready, he ladled it into 2 wooden bowls and handed one to her. Their fingers brushed for a fleeting second, his skin warm and rough against hers. She recoiled slightly, a jolt of alarm running through her, and he immediately withdrew, his face a shuttered mask. He sat on the stool opposite the hearth, leaving the entire space between them. He ate with the same quiet focus he applied to everything, his gaze directed at the fire. Alara looked down at the bowl in her hands. The stew was simple, but it was hot and nourishing. The aroma of meat and earth filled her senses, and she realized she hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. Her hunger was a sharp, aching pain. She lifted the spoon, her hand trembling slightly, and took the first mouthful. It was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. The warmth spread through her, chasing away some of the deep, settled cold. They ate in silence, two strangers bound by necessity, sharing a meal in the heart of the wilderness. Days bled into one another, marked not by a calendar but by the rising and setting of the sun. A routine began to form, unspoken and unnegotiated. He would rise before dawn and leave, returning hours later with game, or wood, or water from a hidden spring. Alara, in turn, began to impose her own order on the small dwelling. She swept the earthen floor until it was smooth, mended the tears in his spare tunic with thread she'd found in a small wooden box, and learned to grind corn into meal with a stone mortar and pestle she discovered. She did not know what he expected of her, so she simply did what needed to be done. It was work, and work was familiar. It kept her hands busy and her mind from dwelling on the bleakness of her situation. She was a ghost in his home, moving through his spaces, touching his things, yet they remained orbits apart. He slept on his pallet. She, after a few nights of refusing, finally accepted a smaller pile of furs he laid for her on the opposite side of the hearth. The fire was always between them, a silent, flickering chaperone. She learned him not through words, but through observation. She saw the way he would pause before entering the house, his eyes scanning the horizon, a habit so ingrained it was like breathing. She noticed the intricate, faded tattoos on his forearms, symbols whose meanings were lost to her, and she began to understand what the townspeople meant when they said he was haunted. It was not a spirit that followed him, but a memory. Sometimes, when he thought she was not looking, a profound sadness would settle over his features. His gaze would become distant, fixed on a point far beyond the stone walls of their home, and his jaw would tighten with a grief so immense it seemed to suck the very air from the room. In those moments, he looked not like a giant, but like a man bearing an impossible weight. She felt an echo of his pain in her own heart, the fresh wound of her own loss aching in sympathy. She began to see that they were more alike than she had ever imagined. Two survivors, haunted by the ghosts of a life that had been stolen from them. One afternoon, while he was away, she found a small, smooth stone by the door, carved with the delicate shape of a hawk. She picked it up, its coolness a comfort in her palm. It was not for her, she knew. It was simply a thing he had made. But as she held it, a fragile, tentative feeling began to take root in the barren soil of her heart. It was not trust, not yet, but it was the seed of it. The fragile peace of their silent existence was shattered by the sound of approaching horses. Alara was outside, tending to a small patch of hardy squash she had managed to coax from the unforgiving soil near the base of the cliff, when she heard the drumming of hooves on the hard-packed earth. Her blood ran cold. It was a sound that did not belong here, in this secluded refuge. Kano was out hunting, checking his snares in the higher canyons. She was alone. She straightened up, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, and saw them cresting the rise, 3 riders, their forms dark and menacing against the bright, indifferent sky. Leading them was Silas Croft. His face, when he saw her, twisted into a smirk of vindictive triumph. He reined his horse in, the animal snorting and stamping impatiently. The 2 men with him were Redemption's refuse, thugs who did Croft's bidding for coin and cruel sport. "Well, look what we have here," Croft called out, his voice dripping with condescension. "Playing house with the savage, are we, Alara? I knew you had no shame." Alara's hands clenched into fists at her sides. The fear was there, a familiar, icy grip, but something else rose to meet it. A hot, defiant anger. This place, this small patch of earth she was tending, had become hers. The quiet man who lived here had given her sanctuary when men like Croft would have left her to starve. "This is not your land, Silas," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. "You have no business here." Croft laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "I have business wherever a white woman is being held against her will. We've come to rescue you," he dismounted, his boots crunching on the gravel as he advanced toward her, "and to persuade your host that this land would be better served by civilized folk. There's talk of silver in these hills." So that was it. Greed, plain and simple. Her presence was merely the excuse. "I am not being held," she said, standing her ground, though every instinct screamed at her to run. "I am here by choice. This is my home." The declaration surprised them, surprised her. But the moment the words left her lips, she knew they were true. This strange, silent arrangement had become her life, and she would not let this man tear it down as he had everything else. Croft's smirk vanished, replaced by a scowl. "You're home? With him?" He spat, the word thick with venom. "Don't be a fool. You're coming back with us." He reached for her arm, but before his fingers could touch her, a voice cut through the air, low and cold as a winter wind. "She is not going anywhere." Kano stood at the edge of the clearing, having approached with the silence of a hunting cat. He held a bow in one hand, an arrow nocked but not drawn. His presence was immense, radiating a palpable aura of contained power. He was no longer just a sad, quiet man. He was a warrior defending his territory. Croft and his men turned, their bravado faltering for a beat in the face of the towering Comanche. "Stay out of this, Indian," Croft snarled, recovering his bluster. "This is between us decent folk." Kano took a slow, deliberate step forward, his eyes never leaving Croft's. "She said this is her home," he stated simply. "Her word is the only one that matters here." "She doesn't know what she's saying," one of the thugs muttered, his hand inching toward the pistol at his hip. In that moment, Alara acted. She did not think. She simply moved. She darted back toward the house, her mind fixed on the one weapon she knew was inside. The old, heavy rifle Thomas had owned, which Kano had cleaned and stored above the hearth. She burst through the door, grabbed the firearm, and was back outside in a matter of seconds. She was clumsy with it, the weight unfamiliar in her hands, but her resolve was pure iron. She raised the barrel, pointing it squarely at Croft's chest. Her arms trembled from the strain, but she held it steady. "Get off this land," she ordered, her voice clear and strong. The sight of the frail woman they'd come to rescue, now holding them at gunpoint, stunned the men into a momentary silence. Croft stared at her, his expression a mixture of disbelief and fury. He saw she was not the broken, helpless widow he had driven from her farm. He saw a woman who had found something worth fighting for. That realization seemed to enrage him more than anything else. With a roar of frustration, he drew his own pistol. "You'll regret this, both of you." But he was too slow. In the instant Croft's gun cleared its holster, Kano moved. He was not a blur of motion, but a force of nature. He dropped his bow and crossed the distance between them in 3 powerful strides. There was a sickening crunch as his fist connected with the gunman's wrist, sending the pistol flying. The second man lunged at him, but Kano sidestepped, using the man's own momentum to throw him hard to the ground, where he lay gasping for air. Croft, clutching his broken wrist, scrambled back in terror. Kano stood over him, not with rage, but with a chilling, absolute finality. He did not need to speak. His eyes promised a swift end should Croft ever return. With a pathetic whimper, Croft staggered to his feet and fled to his horse, his remaining man close behind. They galloped away, a cloud of dust their only legacy. The silence that descended was profound. The world seemed to hold its breath. Alara slowly lowered the heavy rifle, her arms aching, her entire body trembling from the surge of adrenaline. Kano turned to look at her, his gaze intense. He looked at the rifle in her hands, then at her face. For the first time, she saw a clear emotion in his eyes, a deep, quiet respect. He had not fought for her. She had not fought for him. They had stood together and fought for their home. The aftermath was quieter than the life that had preceded it. The violence had passed over them like a storm, leaving the air clean and charged. Alara leaned the rifle against the wall of the house, her hands still shaking. Kano walked over to where Croft's pistol lay in the dust. He picked it up, examined it with a detached curiosity, and then methodically dismantled it, tossing the useless pieces into the scrub brush. He was erasing the intrusion, restoring the sanctity of their space. He approached her then, stopping a few feet away. His eyes scanned her face, searching for a fear that was no longer there. It had been burned away in the crucible of the confrontation, replaced by a hard, bright certainty. "You were not afraid," he said, his voice low. It was a statement of awe. "I was," she admitted, her own voice barely a whisper. "But I was more afraid of losing this." Her gesture encompassed the simple dwelling, the small garden, the vast, protective sweep of the mesa. It encompassed him. The unspoken truth of her words hung in the air between them. Losing him. He looked away toward the horizon, a familiar sadness touching his features. The ghosts were close now, drawn out by the echoes of violence. "My wife," he began, the words sounding rusty, as if they had not been spoken in years. "She was not afraid either. When they came, the soldiers, she stood before our lodge. Just as you did." His voice broke on the last words, a raw, ragged edge of pain. He did not continue. He did not need to. Alara finally understood the depth of his haunting. She saw it all. The lost family, the slaughtered people, the solitary survival of a man who had nothing left but the ghosts of what he had loved. She took a hesitant step toward him, her heart aching with a sorrow that was both his and her own. She gently touched his arm, the one with the faded tattoos. His muscles tensed beneath her fingers, but he did not pull away. It was the first time she had initiated contact, the first time a touch between them was not accidental. It was an offering of shared grief, a silent acknowledgement that they were both survivors of a brutal world. "I am sorry," she whispered, the words inadequate but deeply meant, "for all you have lost." He turned his head and looked down at her, his dark eyes filled with a universe of pain. But for the first time, she saw something else stirring in those depths. A flicker of light, a release. By standing with him, by defending their shared home, she had not replaced what he had lost, but she had honored the memory of it. She had shown him that courage and defiance were not dead. He slowly raised his other hand and gently, almost reverently, brushed the back of his fingers against her cheek. His touch was rough but incredibly tender. It was not a touch of possession or of passion, but of profound connection, a recognition of the steel he had seen in her. In that single, silent gesture, the final wall between them crumbled into dust. The bargain of "I need a woman, and you need a home" was finally fulfilled, but it had been transformed into something neither of them had ever expected. It was no longer a contract of survival. It was a partnership of souls. That evening, they sat by the fire. The comfortable silence returned, but changed. It was no longer the silence of strangers, but the shared quiet of two people who understood each other without the need for words. He took the small, hawk-carved stone from a ledge and pressed it into her palm. A gift, an acceptance. She closed her fingers around it, its smooth, solid weight a promise in the heart of her hand. The wind soughed around the stone house, a lonely and timeless sound. But to Alara, it no longer sounded like a thief. It sounded like a lullaby. She had come to this place a broken, fearful woman, a refugee from a life that had collapsed around her. Now she was home. She had found her strength not in a piece of land or in the memory of a dead husband's promise, but in the quiet dignity of a haunted man, and in the surprising resilience of her own heart. Together, in the shelter of the ancient mesas, two solitary ghosts had finally found a place to rest, a place to heal, and a place to begin anew.